I think that's really the driving force is you need to be able to increase your purchasing power, increase your potential cash flow or asset value in the future so that you have more to withdraw in the future during retirement. Welcome to Tell Your Boss I Quit with me, Pete Gutekunst, the podcast where we help you financially bridge from where you've started to the life goals you've imagined.
Hey, Pete, so let's talk about historical trends and how people that they're getting closer to retirement or they're in it, what they can learn to better understand the impact of inflation.
Yeah, well, inflation, let's call it what it is. It's a loss of purchasing power, first and foremost. So right now, front and center in the news, we've had a Federal Reserve that's been hiking rates like we haven't seen in a long, long time. And inflation's a big buzzword and a very important issue economically right now. But inflation, let's call it purchasing power, because it's what your dollars can buy next year and 10 years from now and 20 years from now. So when you think about money you have in a bank account, think of it like stamps. I think this is the best example, is if you think back to, the 1980s, a stamp was 12 cents. Probably had a picture of the Soviets and the United States touching hands in linking up in outer space. Fast forward now, and a stamp is 75 cents. So your dollars are not going to go as far as they once did, and that's really the key element to loss of purchasing power. Why it's so important. But when you talk about the history of inflation, you have to recognize that it is not this nice, smooth, orderly thing. The Federal Reserve right now is trying to get to 2% inflation. And for the better part of this century, I'd say, we have been in the 2 and 3% inflation figures. But you go back to those 1980s, we were looking at an average run of 5% historically, which included years that were double-digit inflation, kind of like we've seen a little bit more recently. So inflation is something you need to be aware of because it happens very slowly, like the way paint dries. And I think that's really where it's so critical in your planning, is to understand what just happened last year, maybe even in the last 5 or 10 years, is not historically how inflation works over the length of time. We have to really prepare for the loss of purchasing power, which can catch up on us pretty quickly, as it has in the last couple of years.
I think a lot of the people that really get caught up in inflation are people that are on fixed incomes. Mm-hmm. So what are some of the, what are the long-term effects on inflation for the fixed income people?
Yeah, well, that's a perfect example of why I think it's more important to use the term purchasing power or loss of purchasing power, because when you're on a fixed income, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's fixed. Bonds are called fixed income investments because they pay you a set, known, predictable income, but it's never going to change. So when you have a fixed income and it's the same today as it is next year and the year after that, that's really, I think, the key challenge in trying to managing purchasing power. You have to recognize that if you have enough income to support your lifestyle today, it's not going to be enough if it doesn't change in the next 5, 10, or 20 years into retirement. So it's really critical to understand how inflation affects your fixed income and why you need other sources or abilities to grow what your future income will be.
So as somebody's approaching retirement, how do they prepare or estimate for the future impact of inflation? Because it's inflation now is going to be different as they get older. So how do you prepare for that?
Yeah, well, that's a great question too, because the things you spend your money on are what matters. When you talk about loss of purchasing power, when you talk about inflation, when you hear about that in the news, what you're typically getting is the consumer price index or some measurement of broad economic inflation. But what matters to you is, where do you spend your money? Do you spend it on medical costs or pharmaceuticals? Do you spend it on travel? Obviously, you spend it on food and putting gas in the car. And so those things can really change very differently than the average total number of inflation. So a person who is renting a house, you're going to have a rising cost of rent. Whereas if you have a mortgage and you own your property, that cost isn't going to change. So we don't need to accommodate for changes in cost of living as much if we're not looking at rent. If you do a lot of travel, that can be very volatile with energy costs, but also that's just, a higher rate of inflation typically than other parts of the economy that we see. So you really want to think about what you're spending your money on and where you see those expenses going. And that's, I think, a key factor in preparing for that. So how do you go about doing that exactly? Really, it comes down to, where do you spend your dollars today? What's your lifestyle cost today? And then just running that forward with some modest expectation of how that's going to increase year over year. And as long as we're staying ahead of that number, I think that's really the driving force. Is you need to be able to increase your purchasing power, increase your potential cash flow or asset value in the future, so that you have more to withdraw in the future during retirement. So you really need to think about all of where your spending is going and how it may change over time as well. You might spend your money more on travel today. 20 years from now, maybe you won't be doing as much of that. So those are the things we want to try to cull out and looking at how we're managing for our spending in retirement.
That's interesting. As I get closer to retirement, I start thinking about some of the things, some specific strategies that I can do to prepare, to actually not to prepare, but to protect what I've been saving. So is there anything that you can suggest that people do to protect their retirement savings?
Yeah, we've talked about that for, over the last many years of doing this podcast. I talk a lot about the purpose of an investment. And if we think about what we're trying to do with the dollars that we have, that's how we really focus on protecting. Protecting, I think, has to align to the purpose. Because what happens is you reach retirement, get close to retirement. People always say, I just want to protect what I have. But if they don't account for purchasing power or the loss of purchasing power or inflation, protecting what you have is basically guaranteeing that you're going to be losing value over time. Because if you're just protecting the value of the actual dollar amount that you have, it doesn't buy as much in the future. So it's losing value. So when we think about the purpose, some money is ready to be spent sooner, not later. Some money is for next month. Some money is for next year. Some money is for 3 years. And some money you really don't need to be spending it for, say, 10 years from now. So if that's the purpose of those dollars, that's how we want to protect or guard for inflation. Is the best way to fight loss of purchasing power or fight inflation is to invest in assets that should be expected over time to grow faster than inflation and therefore stay ahead or increase your purchasing power. Certainly at the minimum, maintain your purchasing power. But that has some risk. Those kinds of investments are going to fluctuate more. And so dollars we need or have a purpose of being spent sooner, not later, have to be in a more guarded state, whether that's cash, fixed income, or other instruments that are going to give us some level of protection from that market fluctuation in the short run. But at the same time, the less fluctuation, the less protection against purchasing power that we're also going to have. Because if it's not moving up as much or any more than inflation, we're really not gaining any ground. So we have to have a balancing act between the two.
You were talking earlier about strategies to adjust for the inflation, but once you're there and you're in retirement, I've heard that there are strategies that you can do. There are withdrawal strategies. So is that even a thing? Is that something you can do to hedge against inflation?
Yeah, well, first, let's define what a withdrawal strategy or what a withdrawal rate is. And so if you have $100,000 and you withdraw $4,000, you're taking 4% out. So we'll call that a 4% withdrawal rate, or you want to call it $1 million and it's 40,000. That's a 4% withdrawal rate. So that's a number. Let's say that's a cash flow that you need to support your lifestyle. And so back to that purpose is, where are we going to get $40,000 a year to support your lifestyle in that withdrawal rate? And so are we going to be able to get it from fixed income from an interest rate? Are we going to be able to get it from the growth of assets over time like stocks? So that's really coming back to that purpose. So as you're making those withdrawals, there will be years where the stock market will race ahead and give you much more than your 4% necessary or required rate of return just to give you what you need for that year's withdrawal. So maybe you want to take some of that gain because it's not certain to be there a year from now. On the other hand, if we let that grow over time, it should compound one on top of the other. So we don't want to just take everything from that gain. So that's why we have this balancing act of sort of a middle ground where we might have a little less volatility, but maybe we actually earned the 4% that we needed in my example. And then there will be some money that we just have in cash or something that is a much less volatile, much shorter term expected holding period. And that can be backfilled from big gains in the stock market in a particular year or just excess income from other years. That's how we want to manage your withdrawal rate. If we exceed what we need in a certain year, maybe we'll want to park that in a little less volatile space so that we'll be able to deliver the income you need year by year and not have to depend on hitting our number every single year, because we are going to have some years, especially if we're invested in stocks, that are going to be lower than or maybe even going backwards briefly. So we need to be able to manage the purpose of where we're withdrawing from, and keeping an account for that withdrawal rate over time. So we're really looking a lot at that purpose, and we're looking at where we can get assets from in those windows of opportunity.
When a lot of people are thinking about retirement accounts and, trying to hedge inflation, this might be a question for somebody earlier in the game planning for it, but is there an advantage for having real assets in your portfolio, like homes or apartments and gold bars, commodities, stuff like that? And also to follow up, is it too late to start doing that if you're later in your planning?
Well, really, all of those things are part of your asset allocation. And so they're all driven to give you a potential rate of return, but do it in a different way at a different time than another asset class. For example, dividend paying stocks or value stocks have been doing a little bit better lately, whereas growth stocks really were surging ahead until lately. I'm saying this in July of 2024. Same thing with what you're mentioning about commodities or real estate. It's kind of hard to own real estate in an IRA. It's not impossible, but let's just say you have some rental properties. Well, that could be a good, reliable source of income as long as you have reliable tenants and that isn't too much of a challenge. So that's a reliable cash flow source of income. And as long as you maintain the property, that's good, consistent cash flow. And meanwhile, the asset's still growing. That's different from, say, a bond that's also paying you a good, reliable source of income in a dividend, the interest that the bond issuer is paying you, but they're going to return you your principal at maturity. So your asset's not going to grow in value if we held to maturity, whereas the real estate could be. So could you charge more rent because of inflation? Yes. Could the property go up in value and you want to get out from being a landlord and collecting rent? So there are some advantages to doing those types of things. Meanwhile, you're spinning off some income. That's different from, say, being in the traditional, let's call stock, bond, and cash environment where your stocks are growing, you're selling some of that gain or growth, maybe putting it into bonds to get a little bit of interest or dividend in that nearer to 3-year time horizon, and then cash might be the money that you're spending right now or this year in the next 12 months. So those are just different ways for you to manage cash flow and the growth of assets. And what's good for the stock market and good for the bond market isn't necessarily at the same time what's good for the real estate market and vice versa. So those are just ways to diversify your assets to get an opportunity over time. But I think all of your investments are expected to deliver an anticipated reasonable rate of return over time. And so stocks would be expected over time to outperform bonds. Bonds would be expected to be less volatile and more predictable in the short run, but are likely to pay us less and do less battle against inflation. Real estate is going to be maybe a little bit of both, and that's what creates an opportunity there. But there's a lot to owning real estate, that requires more work than just putting investments in an account. So I'd be cautious with that. but it certainly creates an opportunity.
We were just talking about the difference or some of the things you can do to balance out your retirement to hedge against inflation. What about, and I know this is probably a generic question. So how do you handle as a financial advisor when somebody, they want to balance the growth along with stability, things like cash and fixed assets, stuff like that? How do you handle that?
Well, if I could tell you probably the most common question I hear, it's, I want my money to grow, but I don't want to lose anything or something like that. They want this perfect set of circumstances. And really is when we look at what can happen in a short period of time, that's where higher expected returning assets like stocks have the most risk. However, over time, they have the best and really the strongest ability to fight inflation because the stock market historically does much better than the average rate of inflation. The 10-year bond yield is going to be basically paying a dividend that's only a little bit better than what the expected rate of inflation is. So essentially, bonds are just keeping up with inflation. So if you have enough money to pay you enough income, and as inflation rises and you need a little bit more income, if you have enough bonds to pay you enough income right now, it's not going to be enough in the future. You're going to need more capital to be able to get that same income. So that's why you need a little bit of both. So how do you balance all of that? It really comes down to, again, back to what you asked earlier about the withdrawal rate. Is if we have a reasonable withdrawal rate, we're not pulling too hard on our longer term investments, and we're buying them time to deliver the longer term expected anticipated type of return. If we have a high withdrawal rate where we need to withdraw no matter what from our stock investments, we are certain to be pulling from them at a bad time, and that's going to undermine our long-term strategy. So how do you balance that is really, you have to look at it from purpose, and I think it's really important to focus on the purpose of why you have stocks and bonds and other asset classes that have some degree of volatility, but maybe not as much as stocks, and then what your overall allocation is. And I find that this industry tends to look too much at the total allocation. How are your assets performing as a whole? And I think when you look at a withdrawal rate and you see, well, I can get so much money I need from my lower volatile assets in this given year, and I can see that buys me time for these other places. And over time, then when we keep that purpose in mind, I think it helps us manage that a little bit more diligently and with better outcomes, as long as we stay focused on that purpose. But at the end of the day, you're still going to look at your total net worth. You're going to look at your balance sheet, and there's going to be some degree of fluctuation that's too uncomfortable. And nothing works if you can't stick to the strategy. So that's how you have to balance these two things together, is purpose as well as just what's your comfort level. And you have to be willing to accept that you're going to get an adequate return to support you in your lifestyle, and not be the one who's going to be bragging at, the neighborhood barbecue all summer long that you have the best performing portfolio. You want to be able to brag that I can sustain my lifestyle for the rest of my life, and I can sleep very well at night doing so.
One of the things, I guess one of the elephants in the room that we should probably talk about is, when somebody retires, they can be retired for 15 or 20 years. And so healthcare is a big problem, because once you're retired, generally, you've got your plan. So how do we hedge against the rising healthcare costs in our retirement?
Yeah, well, first of all, if you said 15 to 20 years, I would say people are likely to be in retirement for 30 years. And inflation, the rate of inflation on healthcare is certainly has been and consistently is running at a higher rate of inflation, and that doesn't seem to be anything that's changing. So what you want to look at, and there's been a lot of studies, Fidelity did some research a number of years ago, and I believe it was going on $300,000 of expense that a person was going to spend on their health care over a married couple's lifetime. Now that includes your Part B Medicare premium and everything, but those things are all growing at a more rapid rate of inflation. So back to what we were saying about how do you know how to prepare for inflation when you're reaching retirement. I was saying if you do a lot of travel or things like that, maybe that is a higher rate of inflation than some other things. We definitely want to break out what your medical expenses would be. So Medicare Part B premiums at a minimum, your insurance premiums at that stage of life. We definitely want to break that out. We don't want to just say you live off of you need to spend $100,000 a year and let's increase that with some rate of inflation. We want to, at the minimum, carve out some amount for health insurance or health costs, because we need to grow that at a more rapid rate of inflation. If we don't do that, we're probably or almost certainly going to come up short somewhere. And so that's where I think it's very important to recognize that, number one, and number two, keep that as a separate line item and grow it at a different rate of inflation. The other part of that I'll say is when you look at your lifestyle today, if you're not retired and you're living off of a net paycheck and this is the dollar amount you think you need in retirement, ask yourself, does my employer pay for my health insurance? Do they pay for some of my health insurance, or am I paying out of pocket for that right now? And for most people in a W-2 kind of environment, you're paying for that or your employer is paying for that. If you are self-employed and you're paying for it out of pocket, it might sort of disappear in the cost of running your business. And when you think about what you actually bring home and deposit and what you live off, it's easy to kind of lose track of that number. Although I would say self-employed person's probably much more hyper-focused on the high cost of health insurance. But you need to add that to your number. So let's just say your lifestyle is $100,000 net in your current W-2 income, but your employer's covering your health insurance. You need to add that to your expected spending, your health cost number to your lifestyle number, and we need to grow that at a higher rate of inflation. I think that's really probably the biggest challenge when we run scenarios and look at potential outcomes. That's the one number where it can really kind of derail a strategy. I work with a lot of veterans and they have TRICARE for life. They don't have to worry about paying for their health insurance. And boy, does that make a huge difference. If you could just toggle that on or off, makes a huge difference in when we run scenarios. So it's really important to measure that, be prepared for that, and also understanding what your options may be. I'd also add to that, if you're thinking you'd like to retire when you're 62 or 63 or even 60, just bear in mind, you're going to be paying out of pocket the full freight of your health insurance, which can be a real surprise if you're not paying, if your employer's paying it today. When you turn 65, Medicare becomes your primary insurer. So the insurance you buy is just the supplemental or the parts that Medicare doesn't cover, because that's your primary insurance. Totally different cost. So if you're going to retire at age 60 and think you can support your lifestyle, but you have to pay for some significant health insurance costs for at least 5 years, that could really kind of change your thinking on early retirement. So I think that really has to come into play and is a huge part of planning for retirement. Thank you for listening. And if our discussion resonates with you, let's start a conversation about what matters most to you. Go to goodfinancial.com, click contact, and schedule a 30-minute chat. I'd love to hear from you.